my in-depth guest today grew up in Leicestershire. He's been an actor, a director, a psychologist, but he's perhaps best known as an author of children's work now. And we are about to find out very much more because Philip Clark is with me. Philip, hello.
Hello, thanks for having me.
That's great to see you. Now, so where was home for you as a lad then?
I grew up in Wigston, I think for the first 10 years of my life. Then my younger brother came along and we had to get a bigger house, so we moved to Oadby. And so I sort of had 2 primary schools, but then mostly Oadby.
Yeah. And you know, was it a happy childhood? You enjoyed yourself in both those places?
I think when looking back, I think I enjoyed Wigston more because we lived in a nice cul-de-sac and all the kids were my age and we all sort of played out together. I think Oadby, because I think of the stage of my life as well, where you're learning a lot more, it becomes more about working and working towards things. It sort of probably got a bit more stressful, but I think that's probably true of most kids going through their teenage years, you know.
Were you a big family or not? Or just the two?
No, it was just me and my brother, my mum and my dad. Yeah.
And were you quite artistic from an early age? I mean, do you remember being creative as a child?
Yes, my mother said I was always writing or acting out and those kind of things. I used to do a lot of school plays and things like that. And I mean, I wasn't very good at writing because I'd suffered from dyslexia, but I was quite creative. It was just usually a problem of getting it all down onto the paper.
So you mentioned being dyslexic, but nobody really knew that at the time. I suppose less was known about the condition anyway.
Well, I thought that, but I mean, it's strange because I was looking at some of the Dyslexia Awareness Week and there was a memo that was sent out in 1994 to headmasters telling them all about dyslexia and the things they should do about it. Well, that was around about the time I did my GCSEs and could have really done with some help, but there was none really. Certainly not at primary school. And I think, like a lot of children who do suffer from it, if they have a hard time dealing with it, nobody really knows, they get frustrated that they can't do the work, and that's when they end up sort of playing up and being disruptive and things like that. So I think there was an element of that as well when I was at school, but no, it didn't get spotted. I contest whether or not they knew about dyslexia because I think they must have done. You know, it was the 60s that it was sort of really came out, and the 80s it was a very big thing. By the time I was at school in the 90s, I think they should have really been looking for it. I'm quite surprised that at least the English teachers, you know, who look at the handwriting and, you know, should be able to spot these things, didn't spot it. And we're not just talking about one teacher. You know, there were a lot of them that I went throughout the years. And when I eventually did get tested, which I think I was 28, the person who tested me, she was quite a well-known psychologist I found later in the field of dyslexia, she said she could tell in the first 5 minutes after I'd written 2 sentences that I was dyslexic, but I still had to go through this 4-hour test to prove it, you know.
So for people who are not sure, how does it manifest itself? Well, you know, what do you have difficulties with?
Well, I think different people have different issues with it. Some have problems with numbers, some have problems reading and writing. You know, that's where there is a difficulty. For me, I had problems reading large blocks of text and my handwriting was very bad. So I'd formulate words in my head, but at the time they'd sort of hit the paper, they didn't. So, for example, if I'm writing the word "here comes," "here comes the ostrich," okay, I get to the word ostrich and I've written a capital T down because the O and the S I've thought of in my head, but before the pens hit the paper, I've sort of written a capital T. So then I have to squeeze in an O and an S before it. And usually, if you have someone who's got a few capital letters within their words, in their sentences, that's usually a sign. Well, that was one of the ones with me anyway. Mm-hmm. But as I said, it affects people differently. There are some people who are fine with writing but have real trouble with numbers and sequencing. So,
is this something that once you're aware of it, you can do something about, or do you just live with it?
Well, I had when I figured it out, I was 28 and I'd left a job at QVC and decided I would do something academic. Being dyslexic and not knowing it, I just thought I wasn't very academic, I wasn't very clever, so it was a big thing for me to go and do that. But I just decided I'd found a subject I was interested in, which was psychology. I just wanted to do it, and I had this great lecturer called Dr. Felix de Beaumont, and when I first started, he sort of addressed the group and said, like, if anybody thinks they may have dyslexia, go and get tested, go and get checked now, because if you do get tested and you can get help. And he told us, key symptoms, and I remember thinking, oh, some of that sounds like me. And that's when I got tested. And because I was at Goldsmiths College, University of London at the time, so they paid for it as well. And normally, I don't know, normally you have to pay, but I got all sorts of support. They gave me a laptop, which I didn't have to pay for. I got a program where I could speak my essays into it and it would write it out for me. I didn't really use that very much though, because I've just found it easier to type, and I knew I'd have to type my exams, so I wanted to go down that route.
Let's just go back then, Philip, to your days at Beecham College, because you were saying, your school days perhaps weren't the happiest ones, but you've been back there again quite recently.
Yeah, well, they weren't happy because I struggled academically, really. Also, I was bullied a bit when I was there. But, I still have, funnily enough, one of my best friends now I met when I was at Beecham College, and that I still see sort of, every other Tuesday. I think when I started my acting, that was through being in plays and things at Beecham. I wanted to redo science because I now have a science degree, but I didn't have a GCSE. So I would retake my GCSE science. So I went back there last year and did it as an evening class and came out with an A. So
before the acting, before the psychology started, though, you went on to do a bit of acting locally, didn't you? Actually, on the biggest stages around the city.
Yeah, I did a version of Oliver Twist when it was the Haymarket. I produced, directed and was in a version of Peter's Friends, which was at the Y Theatre. That was, I think, in '96. I did a few things. I did a tour with the Haymarket as well. Then when I moved to London, I sort of did a few things there. I did Much Ado About Nothing in Wimbledon. Few other things like that, really. But I found that when I did acting, particularly when I wanted to go and do screen and things like that, this is where the dyslexia became a problem again. They'd sort of give you a sheet of text to read, and I wouldn't read it as well because I'm seeing it for the first time, and they didn't really sort of let you go off and learn it and come back. So you'd come on and do your auditions with your pre-prepared piece, and that would be fine. Then they'd give you something to do, and it suddenly became challenging. But I've heard this from a lot of even professional actors like Tom Cruise and Cher. Cher said when she did her reading for Come Back to the Five and Dime, they said it was the worst reading they'd ever heard in their lives. But when she was able to learn the part and go and do it, she was brilliant. So, and
this is because it wasn't diagnosed. Nobody was giving you any leeway.
No, I didn't know I was dyslexic. I just thought I was, not doing a very good job, really.
So, it was a fairly natural progression then, I suppose, from school into the performing arts. Then you ended up on stages we've heard here in Leicester. Why did the move to London come about?
I wanted to do more acting, really, and that was the place to be at the time. This was sort of around about the turn of the millennium. So, there were sort of pockets in Manchester and things where obviously they produced programmes like Coronation Street, but London was really the place to be, especially if you wanted theatre experience and things like that. So I ended up sort of doing evening jobs, and during the day I would go and do auditions and things like that. In the end, though, I just ended up sort of not doing it anymore, getting a bit tired of it, to be honest. And I think that's when I started writing, because it was I felt more creative. I just got more interested in it. And a lot of the things that I've acted in later have been things that I've written myself.
What did you start off writing then? What sort of subjects?
They were sort of short little plays and things like that that were put on at sort of anthology theatre groups and things like that. And then when I went up to Chester, I sort of adapted a couple of pantos and did those. This is my first sort of fiction book, although I've written another book as well, which is a non-fiction book. But it just started by writing scripts, because I was very good at writing dialogue and had a good ear for dialogue. But when it comes to sort of writing a book and you're writing descriptives and things like that, it's a whole new world,
Do you get help with the writing, or can you manage to do it?
I think, to be honest, there were times when I was writing a book thinking, why are you doing this? You're dyslexic. It's ridiculous that you even want to do this. And I would continually proofread and proofread. That was the problem for me, really, was the proofreading of it and rereading it and making sure everything was all right. In the end, I did actually get someone to read it for me and just say, look, if there anything that needs changing or doesn't read quite right, because I am aware that even though I wanted to do it all myself, I just needed someone to read through it and make sure it read well.
Well, we're going to talk about your books and also about the time that you spent doing psychology in the next half an hour here on BBC Radio Leicester. If you just switched on, my in-depth guest today is Philip Clarke. Another choice of music. You've chosen something by Madonna. Why Madonna?
Well, my book, really, with The Prisoners of Wispine, is about a lot of very strong women, really. And when you're talking about strong women, there is no stronger than her, really, is there?
Like Madonna is coming up next.
BBC Radio Leicester.
Maybe it was all too much for a man to take. Everything's bound to break. Sooner or later, you're all that I can trust. Facing the darkest days, everyone ran away. But we're gonna stay here. I know you're scared tonight. I'll never leave your side. When it all falls down, I'll be your fire when the lights go out. When there's no one else around, we'll be two souls in a ghost town. When it all falls down, I'll be your fire when the lights go out. When there's no one else around, we'll be two souls in a ghost town. When the world gets cold, I'll be your cover. Souls
That's Madge. Well, apparently she doesn't like being called Madge. I think Maddie, I think, is okay. But anyway, Ghost Town, a favourite song of my in-depth guest today, Philip Clark, who's with me in the studio. So, Philip, we've been talking, about your early life so far, and the fact that you then ended up doing psychology. I mean, where did the love of psychology come from? From being a sort of an actor-writer sort of situation?
I suppose really I was interested in counselling and things like that, and maybe getting a job doing that. I mean, it didn't happen that way at all, but I think that was sort of what I was interested in. And also living in London as well. I mean, anybody who's lived in London will know you sort of get onto the tube or something every morning and get a copy of the Metro, and usually embedded in these news articles are sort of things psychologists have found out. And I think it interested me how they found out these things, really, which is why I went and did the degree, really. And I just found the more I read about it, the more I was interested in it. I thought, well, that's the subject I should do, really.
Wow. So how did you go about applying? Because I suppose your qualifications at the time might not have been up to that sort of level.
Well, no, I mean, that's why I did a year at Goldsmiths at the University of London, which I suppose was the equivalent of doing an A-level, but it was a foundation year. But I decided I wouldn't be a student. I would go to the University of Chester and do my full degree because I thought it would be less expensive than living in London.
Now, you've already talked a little bit about, the start of your psychology experience. And for people who weren't listening sort of 20 minutes or so ago, just remind us, this is at the stage when you actually had your dyslexia confirmed.
Yeah, I had it confirmed at Goldsmiths. I got tested very early on. So I did quite well, actually, in that first year. And then I went on and did the 3-year degree. I got a first-class degree from it. And I got, I was able to do my exams on a computer. And I mean, I think there were people who were in worse situations than me with it, where they had to sort of have things on coloured paper, and they're all different provisions that they have depending on how it went. But I think if it was a subject I was interested in, so I retained the information better.
And do you think the fact that you had this dyslexia, did that sort of fuel your interest even further in the psychology behind that, or was that a separate issue really?
Yes, and maybe that was why I did very well in developmental psychology, because dyslexia is one of the things that was talked about. And I mean, there are lots of different subjects, but that was definitely one of them. And I was able to say, oh well, I've got this, so I can relate to certain things.
You had papers published in psychology, didn't you?
Well, I did two. One didn't get published, which was all about psychometric testing in the workplace, and it's to do with occupational psychology. But the one that did get published was about threat detection. And we were testing the police, and it was all about whether they could spot faces in a crowd, the threatening faces over the non-threatening faces. So we tested the riot police, we tested trainee police, and we had a control group as well. And I mean, the prediction was that the riot police, because they are used to spotting these kind of things, would be able to spot them at a much faster rate than anybody else, and that was the case.
Wow, so I mean, you don't think about that being an element of psychology, but of course it is. And was this connected to with video games? Because you did something around video games.
Oh no, that was something I did before. It was the effects of violent behaviour based on video games. So I had two groups. I had a control group and had people playing the violent video game and a non-violent one. And we'd basically sort of test violent responses after they played the game. And we found that the people that had played the game did sort of trigger more violent responses. I mean, also, this was at the time when we had things like the whole Jamie Bulger thing and so things like that were in the news, and it was quite a thing to investigate at the time. People were very interested in it. I was more interested in video games than film, though, because I think there'd been cases, particularly regarding shootings in America, where they'd been practicing with those kind of games before they went and committed these awful crimes. So that was why we investigated that. But that was just my project for my dissertation. It wasn't a published piece of research.
And there was even evidence that those involved with 9/11 used video games, the simulators, to actually learn how to fly an aircraft. And that kind of, so all these things are all part of it, I guess.
Mm. But I think with video games, it's one of those things in our culture, and it's for kids. I mean, somebody I knew worked in a game shop, I think the mother came to them and with Grand Theft Auto and said, "Is this all right for my teenage boy?" Well, really, no, it's not. But, you know.
And do you think there are perhaps some parents who just don't realise how damaging it could be, particularly for younger minds?
Well, they have certificates on them now, don't they? Like films, video games, which certainly when I was younger they didn't have. So, and I mean, I went to the BBFC to talk about film censorship and things, and also they do video games. And the message I really got from them is they don't really censor anymore. It's all about classification. People over the age of 18 can watch anything they like. The only time they really ever censor anything is if it's against the Obscene Publications Act or if it's not in the public interest. So say if there's a film that shows somebody how to build a bomb, they will cut that out. And certainly in terms of kids' films, they're very big on imitable behaviour. In fact, my book, which is It's All Started with a Mouse, one of the things I talk about for Lilo and Stitch, which got cut out, is they had Lilo climb into a washing machine at the start of the film, which in the British version gets cut out because that's seen as imitable behaviour. We can't have that, but it's still there in the American version.
Brilliant. Well, the psychology thing was obviously a big interest for you. Were you intending to make that into a full-time career, or did you slowly start to lose interest in that side of things?
I didn't really lose interest. It was a case of when you're doing research, once the research finishes, you're out of a job and you're back signing on again, and looking for the next piece of research. And in terms of sort of carving up a future for yourself, really, I wanted something a bit more permanent.
So what next then? How did you get from psychology to begin writing for two things, for children but also this other book, which is more of a kind of a reference book about films, wasn't it?
Well, the reference book really just started out of an interest in writing one of those types of books, really. I wanted to buy one, and there wasn't one about animated movies like this, so I just thought, well, I'll write it myself, and that's why I did that. With the other book, I'd adapted a couple of pantomimes like Peter Pan and Cinderella, while I did my psychology degree. That was sort of something I did as a sort of hobby, and really enjoyed it, and just thought I want to do something, because the thing is with theatre, it's sort of seen for the nights that the show is running, and then that's it. Whereas with a book, it exists and it's there forever, really. So that was why I wanted to do a book like that, and it's sort of, it's the size of a Mills and Boon book, really. So it's not a particularly huge book, the fiction one. It's about 200 pages for sort of 8 to 9 year olds onwards, really. But it's a sort of fantasy meets fairy tale with a bit of a murder mystery thrown in, really.
So this is The Prisoners of Wispine.
Yes.
Both of these have been published this year, haven't they? They're all both very new.
Well, I wrote them both together, really. So I thought when I sort of was a bit tired of one, I'd go and work on the other one. I think the Disney book did get finished first. And got published first, but The Prisoners of Wispine I think is more special to me because it's my own work, it's my own story, whereas the other book is reviewing films. That's a bit of a tome of a book. It's about 400 and 500 pages long, but The Prisoners of Wispine it's about a group of women in a land where magic's been outlawed, and they've all sort of practiced magic in various forms and been rounded up by this dictator, and they're in this converted castle with their magic stripped away from them. So you've got a witch who sort of had her brain brainwashed so she can't remember how to do spells anymore, but she still tries and gets them a bit wrong. We've got a fairy who's essentially been stripped of all of her powers, but there are other people, sort of generals. We have a princess who's in there. There's just, a couple of ordinary people who have managed to use magic or, found a wand and used it, got caught and put in the slammer. And it's sort of, you get a lot of sort of prison dramas, but this is a little bit different because they're not really guilty of any crime other than what somebody else has decided is now a crime, which is practicing magic. And I think it sort of came to me based on an old TV series in the 80s called Tenko. I don't know if you remember that.
Tenko, blimey, that's going back a bit, yeah.
Well, what was different about Tenko as opposed to all the other prison dramas is the women, because they were prisoners of war, they weren't guilty of anything other than circumstance. So I wanted these women not to be really guilty, not to have done bad, horrible things like murder people, but to be guilty of a circumstance. And club together and work together that way. The problem is they all have differences with each other, and one of them's been up to no good. It gets found out, and there is a murder. So that's where the murder mystery element in it
Is it sort of like Tenko meets Harry Potter then? Is it a bit like
well, I wouldn't say that, but I see where you're coming from. But yeah.
Is there likely to be a sequel then?
I've just started one. I said if there wasn't a positive response to it, I wouldn't bother doing a sequel. But it has had a positive response from people that have read it. So I thought, oh, maybe I should do one then. But I mean, this first story, it's split into 3 parts. So there's effect, cause, and aftermath. So the cause section in the middle is sort of a series of flashbacks regarding why this person's been murdered. And actually, the motives that you've had so far in the book are probably not as correct as you think there are. So it's the other side of the coin, the other side of the story. But there's an overall arc which deals with the situation as to why magic's been outlawed and who, by, and why. And the second book is all about dealing with that.
Where can people get The Prisoners of Wispine then?
It's available on Amazon, and it's available on lulu.com, and I think Barnes and Nobles. Both of them are available from that. My author name actually is Philip R. Clarke. There's an R in the middle, so if you're just searching for Philip Clarke, you might not find it. But if you search for Philip R. Clarke on Lulu or Amazon,
that's
they
probably
should
why I had a
come
little
up.
trouble earlier on, actually. But yes, Philip R. Clarke we're
Yeah.
looking for. There we are. So yeah, but there was that, but also a rather more serious and obviously a sort of a reference book, I suppose, in terms of all the Disney animated movies. I can almost say it. So it all started with The Mouse, the unofficial guide to animated movies, Volume 1. And so there's going to be more than a Volume 1, but this is purely Disney and Pixar then.
Yes, I think Disney is really the leaders when it comes to feature films, and it does only deal with feature films. It doesn't deal with the shorts. I have a short section at the beginning which looks at sort of 10 of the best of the shorts, but it basically starts from Snow White. And it's, well, at the time of publishing, the most recent film was The Good Dinosaur. So that's the last one that's in there. And it basically covers everything, including the direct-to-video sequels, the films that had live action with animation in them as well, like Mary Poppins and Maleficent, I think, is one of the more recent ones. And it also covers all the Pixar films as well.
It's an enormous amount of research. How did you go about putting something like this together? It's a massive undertaking, really.
I mean, the internet helps now with research, but I was very careful not to use things like IMDb and Wikipedia as my reference, because half of that stuff is wrong and half of it is all hearsay. So I sort of had to sort of research a little bit the old-fashioned way by getting out books, but also watching the movies. There are things that I spot in the movies that not everybody might. Finding online interviews with people that worked on the films, things like that, really. So it's more of an information gathering. So each film has got a summary, it's got a trivia section. I list the cast and the main crew. I can't list all the animators because it would be 3 times the size of the book. But I list people like the music, the writers, the directors. And then I sort of go into an in-depth review, which includes the best character, the best sequence, the best song, and then talks about the film as a whole, really, and I give it a rating out of 5.
This is a great sort of reference source then, and I noticed that if you look in the back, you've got a whole section at the back to actually cross-reference everything, just to to make sure it's done in a scientific sort of a way.
Well, I think this is where the psychology degree came in, really, because we had to reference everything, and if we didn't reference it, you lose a mark, So I think I got quite anal in terms of my referencing, certainly with this book. And the problem as well with online references is they sometimes disappear. So sometimes by the time of publishing, if the online reference had gone, I'd have to sort of put initially or allegedly at the start of the sentence to sort of justify that. But there are a few of those, I hope, overall.
Now, this is obviously going to be one that you can bring up to date in the future, in terms of when obviously there'll be more films in years to come. You'll be adding them to the back. But you're saying Volume 1. Is Volume 2 going to be on a different subject, or haven't you quite got that far yet?
If there is a Volume 2, because I think initially when I spoke to publishers, they wanted to do sort of DreamWorks as well. But at the moment, I'm concentrating on doing a sequel to The Prisoners of Wispine. So I don't know whether there'll be a Volume 2 yet or what it'll be. I think, to be honest, if anything, there'll be a more up-to-date version of this one.
Well, all this in spite of dyslexia, And speaking on Dyslexia Awareness Week, couldn't have been more appropriate, really. Really well done, Philip R. Clark, on all that you've achieved so far. Thank you very much for being our in-depth guest today. Just one final song from you. What have you chosen and why?
Well, I've chosen a song. It's my favourite male vocalist and my favourite female vocalist who got together in the 80s and did a song written by my favourite songwriter. So when I was asked to pick a song, this was one of the first ones that came to mind. It's Dead Ringer for Love.
And it's Meatloaf and Cher.